Hello and good morning. So today we are going to read a biography. A biography is a story about a person. It gives information about their life. So we are going to read about Helen Keller. And while we're reading this, I want you to think of a couple of things that are important and a couple of things that are interesting but not as important. Because what we're going to do is we're going to pack a story suitcase. So you're going to get paper and you're going to make a story suitcase. I'm just taking a piece of paper. I'm going to fold it in half so it opens like a suitcase. So it opens like a suitcase. I'm going to use some of my crayons. Mr. Upton got me birthday crayons. Ooh, birthday crayons. So I'm using my birthday crayons for the very first time. I'm going to give my birthday suitcase a handle. So I just drew a little handle on my little suitcase so I can open it. And I'm opening up my suitcase. I am going to be able to pack my suitcase. So I want to divide my suitcase into two parts. So now I have two sides for my suitcase. One side of my suitcase is going to be for really important things. So I'm going to label that side important. You do not have to label it important if you don't want to. But I'm going to label one side important, and I'm going to label the other side interesting. Now, if you want to give it a short label, you could do, oh, I broke a crayon. Oh, well. You could do, poor sad crayon. You could do a capital I for the important side and a lowercase I for the interesting side. But you're going to be able to make the suitcase, and when you're done, you can decorate your suitcase however you want your suitcase to look. We're going to have an important side and an interesting side. While I'm reading, your job is going to be to think of some things that are important or interesting. You can do it. You can fill this in while we're reading, or you can wait until we're done. You're going to choose one or two things that were really important about Helen Keller and one or two things that were just interesting. We're packing a story suitcase. So let's get ready for our story. Oh, sad. I broke my blue. All right. Helen Keller, an inspiring life. Let's find out what makes Helen Keller so interesting. Helen Keller was deaf and blind. Deaf means she could not hear. Blind means she could not see. But that did not stop her. She wrote books and traveled around the world. Read on to learn about her inspiring life. Helen Keller lived from 1880 to 1968. She was a hero to many people. So on this page, is there something important about her, do you think? Is there something interesting? We'll keep reading to find out. Helen was born in Alabama in 1880. She was a happy baby, but when she was almost 2, she got very sick. For days, she had a high fever. There's a label up here, a caption. Helen's parents worried about Helen while she was sick. After the fever passed, Helen was not the same as before. Her parents realized that she couldn't hear or see. The illness had left her deaf and blind. See the caption? Helen could not see spring flowers or hear birds sing. Do you think that was important to her life, that she could no longer hear or see? Do you think that might change her life? Helen could not hear words, so she could not learn to speak. It made her angry because she couldn't communicate. Sometimes Helen got so angry she would kick and scream. Can you imagine how frustrating it would be to not be able to tell your parents if you needed something, or to be able to hear them tell you something? That would be very frustrating. Helen found ways to let her parents know what she wanted. When she wanted ice cream, she pretended she was cold. When she wanted her father, she pretended to put on glasses. Interesting. She was a problem solver. Do you think it's important that she's a problem solver? Helen made movements to show what she wanted. Do you make any movements to show what you want? When Helen was 6, a teacher named Anne Sullivan came to live with her family. Anne wanted to teach Helen how to communicate with words. But how? Anne brought Helen a doll. Anne spelled letters with her fingers in the palm of Helen's hand. Annie spelled the letters D-O-L-L. Then she handed Helen a doll. But Helen didn't understand that the letters spelled doll. Do you think the doll is important or just interesting? Do you think the doll will change your life? One day, Anne had an idea. She led Helen to the water pump. Annie let the cold water run over Helen's hand. Then she wrote the letters W-A-T-E-R. That spells water. In Helen's palm again and again. For many weeks, Anne tried to teach Helen about words. It was a very difficult job. Suddenly, Helen understood. The letters spelled water. Now she knew that everything had a name. I learned a great many new words that day, Helen later wrote. Mother, father, sister, and teacher were some of the new words Helen learned that day. Wow, so she couldn't communicate before, but now she could. Do you think that's important? Helen later learned to read books in Braille. These books had raised dots that stood for letters. Helen could feel the dots with her fingertips. She also learned to write and speak too. Helen loved books. She read them one after another. When Helen was 20, she went to college. She also wrote a book about college. She also wrote a book about her life. Now people all over the world could read Helen's amazing story. Helen used a special typewriter to write. Her first book was called The Story of My Life. Over the years, Helen visited more than 30 countries. She met many deaf and blind people on her travels. Everywhere she went, she gave people hope. The leaders of many countries wanted to meet Helen. For the rest of her life, Helen worked to help deaf and blind people. She showed them that they too could do many things. Today, people remember Helen Keller as a true hero. We can do anything we want to do if we stick to it long enough, Helen said. This timeline shows some of the important events in Helen Keller's life. We talked about a timeline. A timeline is a line that shows time. It shows events in people's lives. 1880, Helen Keller was born. 1882, Helen gets sick. She becomes deaf and blind. 1887, Annie Sullivan comes to live with Helen, and Helen learns her first words. If it's on the timeline, do you think that's really important? 1902, Helen writes a book about her life. 1904, Helen finishes college. 1913, Helen begins making speeches to help deaf and blind people. Did this include every single event in her life? No, but it did include some of the events in her life. So now your job is to think about your story suitcase and come up with one or two things that were important in Helen Keller's life and one or two things that were just interesting. I can't wait to hear and see what you thought was important and interesting about Helen Keller's life. Thank you. See you soon.